All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a really interesting one, Calvary Chapel. You might know it as this huge global movement that kind of blew up out of the 60s counterculture and eventually became this massive network of churches. But, with that kind of growth, you're bound to get some serious controversy. So let's just get right to it. The question that seems to follow this organization everywhere: is Calvary Chapel a cult? I mean, that's a heavy accusation, right? To even begin to answer that, we've got to be really careful. We need to pull apart two things: what the organization says it is and the specific controversies that people talk about. Okay, so first things first, let's take a look at how Calvary Chapel present itself to the world. What's the official story? When you look at their doctrines, what they actually believe, Calvary Chapel is planted firmly in what you'd call mainstream Christianity. They affirm the basics: Jesus is God, the virgin birth, his miracles, his death and resurrection, all that. These are super standard beliefs you'd hear in tons of non-denominational churches all over the world. So we're not talking about some kind of fringe theology here. And structurally, well, it's not some top-down pyramid. It was founded by Pastor Chuck Smith, and officially, it's a global fellowship of autonomous churches. And that word autonomous, that's really the key here. It means the local churches are supposed to be independent, making their own decisions. So, on paper at least, it's more of a loose network, not some rigid, centrally controlled hierarchy. Okay, so if their beliefs are mainstream and their structure is supposed to be decentralized, why does this cult question just not go away? To figure that out, we can't just go on feelings. We need, an objective framework. So let's take a look at how experts, religious scholars, actually define what a cult is. Yeah, so experts usually point to three big telltale signs. First sign: a really high level of control over the personal lives of its members. What they do, who they talk to. Second, a single charismatic leader at the top of a strict hierarchy who demands, basically, unquestioning loyalty. And third, they tend to isolate members from the outside world, from family, from friends, creating this us versus them bubble. So this is going to be our yardstick as we dive in deeper. All right, so we've got our framework. Now let's turn to the hard part: the controversies. This is where we get into the specific criticisms that keep this cult question bubbling to the surface. And look, we have to be upfront here. The Calvary Chapel movement as a whole has faced some really serious allegations over the years. We're talking about accusations of mishandling, sexual abuse cases, very public fights between leaders, and real concerns about how authority and power works inside the church. These are deeply troubling issues, and this is where the picture starts to get a lot more complicated. And this right here, this is probably the most critical distinction we have to make. On one hand, you have the mainstream Calvary Chapel movement, which, remember, is officially all about local autonomy. But then you have these specific individual churches, like the well-known Calvary Chapel Chino Hills, that face way more intense allegations. Things like high control over members, socially blacklisting people who disagree, and a ton of political pressure coming straight from the pulpit. One of the key criticisms, and this one is aimed specifically at Pastor Jack Hibbs of that Chino Hills church, really centers on this idea that he, quote, actively rallies his congregation to follow his opinions under the guise of biblical teaching. And for the people raising these concerns, this is a huge red flag. It feels like it completely blurs the line between giving spiritual guidance and basically running a political campaign. So let's recap. We've got the official identity on one side and these really serious controversies on the other. Where does that leave us? What's the final verdict here? Okay, so based on all the evidence and that framework we talked about earlier, the general consensus among religious scholars is pretty clear. As a whole organization, Calvary Chapel is not a cult. Its core beliefs are too mainstream, and its official decentralized structure just doesn't fit the definition that experts use. But, and this is a really important but, that's where the nuance comes in. Saying the organization as a whole isn't a cult, that doesn't just dismiss the very real concerns about control and politics happening in some of the individual churches. It just suggests the problem might be more local rather than systemic, baked into the entire movement. But that doesn't make the negative experiences people have had any less real. And that really leaves us with a much bigger question, one that goes way beyond just Calvary Chapel. It applies to pretty much any group, religious or not. For any organization that asks for a deep level of commitment, where do you draw the line? Where does a strong, supportive community end and a dangerous level of control begin? That right there, that's the real tension at the heart of this whole conversation. And it's definitely something worth thinking about.